Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Once I built
These are some of the historic images and sounds that have come to symbolize the American Great Depression.
brick
The Great Depression is an international economic disaster that began in 1929 with the crash of the American Stock Exchange and only ended with the onset of World War II. Except for the very rich, the ability to work, support a family, go to school, and just enjoy life came to a screeching halt. The 1920s were a time of great economic prosperity. With jobs plentiful and money plentiful, the 1920s were a happy time. But the optimism of the 1920s gave way to uncertainty and cynicism about the future. The happy times of the 1920s came to a screeching halt on October 29, 1929, when the American Stock Exchange crashed, the day otherwise known as Black Tuesday. On this day, the stock market lost more than $14 billion, making the loss for that week an astounding $30 billion. The happy times and joyful times of the roaring 20s were now over. Welcome to the age of the Great Depression.
Once in khaki suits, ah gee, we look swell, full of that Yankee Doodle.
As news of the stock market crash spread throughout the nation, it caused a nationwide panic. Customers rushed to their banks to withdraw their money. People who had once been very wealthy lost all their money. Many companies went out of business and a huge number of people lost their jobs. And between 1930 and 1935, about 750,000 farms were lost to foreclosure and bankruptcy. By the mid-1930s, it was estimated that about one-fourth of the nation's families had no regular income. Poverty and home evictions soared across cities and rural areas across the country. Herbert Hoover was the president when the Great Depression began. He declared in March 1930 that the U.S. had passed the worst and argued that the economy would sort itself out. But the worst, however, had just begun, and the reality of life during the Great Depression was harsh. Nearly every person had to adjust to a different way of living than what they were used to. Adults were out of jobs and in dire search for a better life. Children had to deal with changes to their education. Due to a lack of money, schools were forced to close down. Children also suffered from great malnutrition. Children in rural areas were even worse off. Due to the family's low income, an adequate diet was no longer, because they could not afford to buy the proper food such as milk, eggs, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit. Diseases in children increased. Children were often sent to temporary children's homes or charity shelters. Parents who could no longer manage to take care of their children sent them to the children's home. These temporary homes provided children with a place to stay while the parents were able to find jobs.
I've lived, loved, and sorrowed, been to success's door. I've endured, how long can one endure?
The Depression-era youth chose many different paths. Some got small jobs to help provide for their families, but many teenagers of this time were known for riding the rails. These teenagers felt that they were a burden to their families, so they left their homes in search of a job and to create a life of their own. It is estimated that nearly 250,000 teenagers were traveling the rails by 1933. The middle class's life was shaken up when they were out of money and no longer had security. This group of people accounted for 15 to 20% of America's population. The professional jobs they once held were lost or decreased to part-time. They struggled to provide for their families, and by the end of the Great Depression, many of the people could no longer consider themselves to be middle class. But some middle-class families managed to hold on to their homes by getting creative. They would take in boarders to live in their houses. The boarders had to pay rent each month, and this provided the middle-class family income and the boarders a place to stay. For some people who lost their homes, they often live in Hoovervilles, or little shanty towns. These small towns were named after President Herbert Hoover. These Hoovervilles were basically campsites that were set up in towns where the homeless people lived. They were kind of like little tent cities. A turning point of the Great Depression came about when Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Workers and young people were up in arms pushing for the new president to remedy the situation. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal helped unemployed workers and their families. The New Deal created health and welfare programs that were aimed at infants and children. Work and education programs were aimed at teenagers and young adults. Although these measures were great, they did not relieve all the hardships.
Up to the sun, brick and rivet and lime. Once I built a tower, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
The reality of harshness and hardships faced during the Great Depression are all too real for 11-year-old Grace McFarland in Priscilla Cummings' book, Saving Grace. In 1932, during the depths of the Great Depression, Grace McFarland and her family had been hit pretty hard. Just before Christmas, the McFarland family lost their house. Grace and her two younger brothers are placed in a charity shelter. With her mother expecting a baby at any day and her brother Pete being terribly sick, Grace tries to understand that her parents just cannot manage to take care of them at this time. While at the charity shelter, Grace is invited to stay with the Hammond family for Christmas. The Hammonds are a very wealthy family that took good care of Grace. They showered her with gifts, and they treated her like their own daughter. But how can Grace enjoy these fine things and security from the Hammonds while her parents, homeless and jobless, and her brothers are stuck at the charity shelter? What will happen when it comes time for Grace to go home? Will she decide to stay with the Hammonds and live a secure life? And are family bonds more important than a life of luxury? I guess you'll have to find out when you read Saving Grace by Priscilla Cummings.